Everybody. Welcome again to the Atlantic Council on International Relations webinar. This time it's on next move, considerations in the troubled U.S.-Russia relations. This is our second in the series that focuses on great power relations. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, big welcome. We hope you will find the experience very informative, and we hope you will join us again in the future. You can find more about ACIR and our upcoming programs by checking out our website. It's www.atlantacir.org. On behalf of ACIR, I'd like to welcome members of the Atlanta Diplomatic Corps who are joining us today. From Estonia, we have Honorary Consul General Adu Alper. From Hungary, Honorary Consul General John Parkinson. From Korea, Consul General Kim Young-jun. Also, I'd like to welcome many of you who have joined us from our two institutional members, Georgia Tech and the University of North Georgia. And a special welcome to all ACIR members who are with us today, and especially to our speaker, Dr. Dmitri Trenin. 1 month after the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill, unable to predict what the Soviet Union would do, described Russia as a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. For those of you who were with us in January, you heard Dr. Igor Zevaliev explain part of the riddle, noting that geography, history, and a sense of mission help shape Russia's national identity with its concomitant impact on Russian foreign policy. Today, to help us guide us in our efforts to unwrap the mystery of Russia and thus better understand what troubles US and Russia relations, we have with us Dmitri Trenin, who will now be introduced by ACIR's Vice President and Executive Director, Colin Brady. Colin, you've got it.
Thanks, Dr. Kennedy. Professor Dmitri Trenin has been the director of the Carnegie Moscow Center since 2008. At Carnegie, Dr. Trenin chairs the Foreign and Security Policy Program. He was the first Russian to be appointed to this position. He is also a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He was the first non-NATO senior fellow at the NATO Defense College in 1993. Upon retirement from the Russian military, he became a visiting professor at a prestigious university in Brussels. In the mid-90s, Professor Trenin was a senior research fellow at the Institute of Europe at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Trenin is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, the Russian International Affairs Council, and the Russian International Studies Association and other organizations. He received his PhD from the Institute of the USA and Canada from the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1984. Adding a little color to his bio, especially for those of us of a certain age, Professor Trenin is a former colonel in Russian military intelligence. He served for 21 years in the Soviet Army and Russian ground forces, including working as a liaison officer in the External Relations branch of the Soviet forces stationed in Potsdam, and as a staff member of the delegation at the US-Soviet nuclear arms talks in Germany from 1985 to 1981. He also taught at the War Studies Department of the Military Institute of Russia from 1986 to 1993. He is a graduate of Russia's Soviet Union's oldest military college, which might be considered the West Point of Russia. He is the author of more than 10 books, including Russia. What is Russia up to in the Middle East? Should we fear Russia? Russia and the world in the 21st century, and Russian strategic strategy under Putin. Professor Trenin from Moscow Center, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for this, I would say, overly generous introduction. It also reminds me of my age. and I think you referred to that in your introduction. Thank you very much, Bill. That's very generous of you. Let me start by thanking Dr. Kennedy for his invitation to come and speak at the Atlanta Council. We met years ago, and I'm so glad that there has been a follow-up to that meeting and the dialogue that we had by means of email exchanges. I'm glad that I'm not the first person to deal with the subject. You heard my good friend and colleague, Igor Zivelyov, I believe in late January. I will be building upon his remarks in many ways. I agree with, basically agree with what he said. I will talk about the drivers of Russian foreign policy and Russia's relations with the United States, the European Union, and China. I will try to confine my remarks to about 25, 30 minutes in order to give the audience the chance to engage in an interactive dialogue. So I'll be trying to get through my own monologue as fast as I can, because I'm really looking forward to that more interactive and, to me, more interesting part of the conversation. Let me start with something which sounds very banal. Russia is not a new state. Russia is a very old state. The Soviet Union was not another country. The Soviet Union was us, as I think was very clear from my own bio. The Soviet Union, again, was a successor to the Russian Empire, from which the Soviet Union wanted to dissociate itself as much as it could, and yet it was a continuation of that Tsarist incarnation of Russia. Before the empire, there was a Tsardom of Muscovy. Before that, there was Kievan Rus, or ancient Rus, as we now call it in our textbooks. So you have at least 5 historical Russias, which in the Russian thinking about their own history are an unbroken continuum. Well, unbroken, I think, is a wrong choice of words. It's a continuum that has points of seeming discontinuity. But as they say very correctly about Russia, in that country, everything may change in 20 years and nothing will in 200 years. So I think this is something that we all need to keep at the back of our minds. Talking about Russia's foreign policy, I think my principal thesis will be that in the thinking of the Russian leaders, Russian elites, and I would say the bulk of the Russian people, Russia is nothing if not a great power. Now, the meaning of what a great power is has certainly changed in the last, even in the last 30, 40 years. It used to denote a country that occupied an elevated position, even a formalized elevated position in the international community. Today, I think it denotes a country that is its own master, that does not depend on anyone else for its physical protection, and that can stand against pretty strong pressure from even the mightiest countries in the world. So if you can hold your own under sanctions fire from the United States, you can claim that you are an independent player. If you can protect yourself in case you need to do that, without turning to your senior allies or senior ally, then you qualify as a great power. So I think that is something absolutely central to the Russian political psyche. And Russians, I think, certainly Russian leaders and those in the Russian political elite, to them, sovereignty is something truly fundamental about the status of their own country. And as far as the Russian people are concerned, it's in the DNA of the Russian people. This, interestingly enough, this DNA was tested 25 years ago, when Russia, for the first and so far only time in its history, tried to integrate into the community of others where it would cede a fair portion of its sovereignty and look to a leader rather than being the top of the world for itself. That was the period of Russia's attempted Western integration. You would recall in the 1990s, well, some of you with some knowledge of history, and those of you with some personal experience might remember President Yeltsin coming to Washington in 1992, addressing the joint session of United States Congress and pledging Russia's alliance, as he wanted to call it, with the United States. And he ended his speech with "God bless America." And that was a period when, for at least a major portion of the Russian elites, siding with America and accepting the United States as a leader or as the leader looked possible. However, it did not look possible to all the elites, and it was essentially, did not essentially sit well with a fairly large portion of the Russian people. So by the mid-1990s already, it was clear that Russia would not, having been defeated as the Soviet Union in the Cold War, if you like, or having, as many Russians would say, having defeated itself in the process of transformation that ended in failure, domestic transformation that ended in failure. After that, they started thinking more and more about the national interest, and essentially the integration between Russia, or Russia's integration into the West, into Europe, into an alliance with the United States as very much a junior partner. This failed because eventually Russia did not care to buy the ticket to that integration, which to me would have absolutely meant sincere acceptance of American leadership role. This is what all European countries that joined NATO, all American allies around the world did accept, some with excitement, but Russia essentially rejected that. And that, I think, led to a process that eventually took us to where we are today. But we'll talk about it a little bit later. The final moment of that failed integration attempt was reached at the time of the Ukraine crisis in 2014. The Russian vision of its interests, its security interests, its economic interests, and other interests clashed with the Western drive to support democracy, liberalism, pro-Western sentiments, without regard to the former borders of the Soviet Union and without regard to what the Russians thought about it. So that that clash essentially ended the 25-year-long period of Russia's failed integration attempt to become part of the West. A lot of people are saying that after 2014, Russia, quote unquote, pivoted to Asia, pivoted to China. I would take a different view of that. I would say that it actually pivoted to itself. It began to see itself again as a civilization rather than a nation state that needed to integrate with democratic nations of Europe. Russia today stands very much alone in the world. Its attempt to integrate into the Western family as having failed. Russia has also not been able to reassemble its own former family of ex-Soviet republics. For the same, I think that if that failure was essentially driven by the same factors as Russia's about turn in its Western integration. For all former Soviet republics, independence meant, above all, and maybe only, independence from Russia. And no republic, no former republic, now independent state, was eager, certainly, and not even willing to consider sharing much of its sovereignty or any of its sovereignty with the former metropolitan center in Moscow. So Russia stands alone. It did not join the Western family, and it essentially dismissed or lost its own former imperial family. Russian authoritarianism is often blamed for this failure of integration, and I think that's very right on point. But let me play with words a little bit. What we're seeing is not so much Putin's Russia as Russia's Putin. And let me explain. There's a difference between the political cultures, not just political systems, but political cultures of the Russian Federation and of the countries just west of Russian borders, even starting with such closely related countries as Belarus, ethnically and culturally related countries as Belarus and Ukraine. Whatever can be said about the political culture of Eastern Europe, Russia's political culture is essentially Asian. It is a mixture of Byzantine roots and the experience of the quarter millennium that Russia spent as part of the Golden Horde. And this top-down model, this model of a garrison state, essentially, where security trumped everything else, is very much derived from the experience that the Russians received in a very hard way, having been first subjected to the Mongol overlords, and then having bested them, having defeated them, and having integrated them into their own system. As I said, the political values also have their equivalents in social values, which are more traditional than the social values of Europe. The emphasis on being able to fend for itself, to fight off any invader. And Russian geography, if you look at the map, is such that it's essentially the European part of Russia, essentially flat land, and it's open to invasion from the west and from the east and from the south, and you had to be on your guard almost all the time. Its foreign policy philosophy is based on realpolitik. And instead of the rules-based order, Russian leaders talk about international law. It looks like the difference is not great. In fact, it's fundamental. Whereas rules-based order essentially is a universal system, which applies to all, in theory, applies to all nations, wherever they are. International law is based on sovereign agreement among the, theoretically at least, independent powers. And Russia is very firmly wedded to this latter version. Let me now turn for the last 5 to 7 minutes of my discussion today to Russia's relations with the United States. I already noted that after the Ukraine crisis, they came to what I would call confrontation. This is not a new Cold War. Using that phrase, I think, would be misleading because there's only one Cold War history, and if we use it, we will be guided by the visions and reminiscences, expectations that are rooted in that historical experience, and that's not going to be repeated. But and also we will be blind or negligent with regard to other important factors that are operating today, but they were never they were not yet born during the Cold War. So it's call it hybrid war if you like, but essentially it's confrontation. It's very different from the U.S.-Soviet one because Russia is not an ideological or political, clearly not an economic rival of the United States. Essentially, what the Russian leadership wants is for the United States to accept it as it is, to accept its view and respect its view of its national security interests, such as, let's say, if we go back to, say, January 2014, some sort of a neutral status for Ukraine, some sort of a buffer zone between the Russian Federation and NATO. But clearly, there was no chance, in my view, for the United States to accept that, because that would have meant that would have caused damage to the universal message that the United States is keen to broadcast around the world. And giving a special treatment to a country like Russia, given its much diminished status in world affairs compared to the Soviet Union, was certainly not on the cards. Right now, the United States and Russia are facing each other as two very unequal and vastly different countries that are guided by two very different forms of exceptionalism. One form is, I wouldn't talk about the American form of exceptionalism, that is, there are better people and more qualified people in this conference who can discuss that. But I would say that the Russian version is that there's no one above us. We are not a power equal to the United States or to China. We're not a superpower. We're not going to be a superpower again. But we will not tolerate anyone above us. And that, I think, gets you to an impasse between those two versions of exceptionalism. Having said that, I do not believe that U.S.-Russian relations are condemned to be confrontational. Confrontation is a very dangerous state of affairs. It is just one step removed from an open collision. So efforts must be made, and we can hope we can discuss that, by the United States, by Russia, to make sure that there are guardrails built and maintained around that confrontation. That we have reliable channels of communication to make sure that incidents, especially involving military platforms or servicemen or troops, do not happen. And when they do happen, they do not lead to an escalation. That conflicts in which both countries are involved on opposite sides, or not exactly on the same side as in Syria, do not get out of hand and lead to a conflict between the United States and Russia. Certainly the risk of escalation, the risk of finding ourselves in a shooting conflict is not negligible. A lot must be done to make sure that these risks are minimized. Hopefully, some other issues such as cybersecurity can be tackled with more confidence, more self-confidence, and more constructively, so that we can have an agreement at some point about where the red lines lie. Basically, people will be in this borderless world, very different from the world of the Iron Curtain, the world of the Berlin Wall, etc. Now, there are no walls, there are no curtains, not impenetrable curtains. You would have to expect in all countries that people will be seeking entry into your secret files wherever you are. And I think it's up to you to build defenses. But there must be an agreement among responsible powers, or between responsible powers, that these forays are confined to, let's say, the common room, and certainly the bedroom where the political process is taking place in particular countries remains off limits to outside interference, so that national systems of leadership, choosing leaders, choosing parliaments is immune from that kind of interference. I think this is essentially possible. There are other areas where the United States and Russia can and should collaborate, and that includes non-proliferation. That includes, by non-proliferation, I mean, first of all, Iran, North Korea, but also other areas, other countries where nuclear can make an appearance at some point. We have to be on our watch. I also think that climate, interestingly enough, the awareness of the Russian leadership with regard to the importance of climate-related issues is rising, and rising very fast now. It's linked to the energy situation. It's linked to the situation of Siberia, which is experiencing pretty fast climatic change, and certainly the Arctic, where the melting of our ice cap is going faster than most people predicted. So I think that there are areas, and of course the pandemic, public health care, where despite all the bad feeling about the other side, all the bad sentiments, all the restrictions, all the adversarial comments, rhetoric that government leaders are making about the other country, we still can find enough common ground to talk about issues that matter to us all. Very quickly about Europe and China, I think we can discuss that at some length during the Q&A. Europe, since 2014, since Ukraine, Russian-European relations have been marked by progressive alienation. And I think to some degree, they can also be described as confrontation today, certainly with some European countries. Europe is not of the same mind on Russia, although formally the EU member states managed to preserve union solidarity with regard to relations with Russia, with regard to sanctions on Russia. And in particular, Russia's most important relationship in Europe, that with Germany, has suffered tremendously in the months since Alexei Navalny's evacuation from Siberia to Berlin in early September last year, and his return from Germany to Russia in January. So relations with Europe are at a low point, and Russia, I think, is seeking to build better bilateral ties with some countries, with the countries that have economic interests to collaborate with Russia. But that's going to be heavy lifting, and it's not. Let me put it differently. Within the European Union, it will be very difficult for any country to break ranks or to do things that a significant number of other countries would object to. So there's a clear limit to how far the bilateral relationships can flourish between Russia and individual European countries in the general atmosphere of worsening Russian-European relations. By contrast, relations with China can be described as an entente. To me, this is a state between strategic partnership, which is the official term used in Beijing and Moscow with regard to the relationship, and an alliance, full-fledged alliance that is still not there. I believe that such an alliance, a formal alliance, will not be agreed upon by Beijing and Moscow, because it would limit the maneuver room primarily for Russia, and then it would scare a lot of people without giving much payoff for Beijing and Moscow. China will find it. China, which is in a more clearly in a stronger position economically, financially, and technologically in that alliance, will still find it difficult to manage Russia, even as a, let's say, relatively junior partner. It's hard. I would say it's impossible at this point. And Russia certainly would not want to have its hands tied, particularly given the fact that China and the United States are now the two most consequential, most important powers that are locked in a confrontation, which has military overtones. So when serious Russians address the Sino-American confrontation, many of them have memories of the Anglo-German confrontation of the early 20th century, into which Russia stepped, I would say, mindlessly, and became involved in the First World War as a result, which of course led to enormous calamities for Russia. So let me stop here and turn the floor over to you again. And I look forward to your comments, questions, and criticisms. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Trenin. That was an outstanding sort of very high-level summary of a lot of information. And we appreciate your expertise in that. There are a number of questions that have come up. My name is Bill Bozarth. I'll be the one sorting out those questions and posing them to you. So let's start with this one. There's a couple of questions about Crimea, And it hinges on how do we actually get by that in terms of relationships between the United States and Russia, or between the West and Russia. Another comment along those same lines is that we really shouldn't be surprised at Russia wanting that port back in the Black Sea. It would be akin to us losing one of our ports, for instance, in Norfolk, because one of the other states didn't want us to have it there. Can you just comment on Crimea in general and the issues there as you see them, please?
Well, thank you, Bill. In my view, the issue of Crimea is not so much geostrategic as I think Putin couched it when he was talking about the incorporation of Crimea into the Russian Federation in March 2014, when Crimea was formally being incorporated into the Federation. The issue is that Crimea is overwhelmingly populated by ethnic Russians. And until the mid-50s, it formally belonged to the Russian Republic within the Soviet Union. So you have a very strong feeling, and that was the only portion of Ukraine, or I would even say the only portion of the former Soviet Union where the local ethnic Russian community was not only wedded to the culture of Russia, the language, which is Russian, but also to the Russian state, very much because of the naval port of Sebastopol, which actually employed a lot of people in Crimea. So a lot of people in Crimea, a lot of Russian, not only Russian, Ukrainian, because the Soviet Union did not make a distinction between those nationalities. They grew up in the atmosphere, as you would imagine, in a naval city, in a naval port, of a special attachment to the state, special brand of patriotism. So it's not like, let's say, it's not like Russian people in Latvia or Estonia. It's a very different kind of attachment, very different kind of pride, a very different kind of belonging. To answer your question, I don't think it will be an issue between Russia and the West. I think it is, and it will remain for a very long time, and as I can see, an issue between Russia and Ukraine. And when Russia and Ukraine at some point reach an understanding about Crimea, and let me say very honestly where I stand, I stand with the people. To me, what people want, what the majority of the people want, is how things should be. This applies to Crimea, this applies to Kosovo, this applies to a number of other places. So I think that it will take a long time, very possibly generations, for Ukrainians to recognize and reach out for some kind of a deal with Russia on that issue. And after that, after Ukraine agrees, then I think the West will follow. But it will not be a deal struck by Russia and the United States, Russia and US and Europe over the heads of the Ukrainians. I don't think so. I don't believe in it. So the status quo as it exists now, I think will continue for a fairly long time.
Okay, thank you. Next question focuses on something you said earlier, that perhaps Russia should be viewed more as an Asian country, but are not some of the core elements of Russia Orthodox Church and European related?
Well, when I said Asian, I talked about the political culture. And the political culture, as I said, let me repeat it, is built on two pillars. One is Byzantium, Constantinople, the Eastern Roman Empire. And that's where Christianity in its Orthodox form was adopted by Russia. And the other pillar was that of the Golden Horde, the Mongols, etc. In terms of Russian culture overall, it's clearly European. But this does not make Russians part of, and will not make Russians part of political Europe for the reasons I have cited. I sometimes draw parallels between Russian and American attitudes to Europe. You may say that America has imported a lot of European culture. It's based on essentially European culture. Not only British culture, but culture coming of many nationalities that sent their more active members to North America. And yet it would be ludicrous for Americans to apply for a membership in the Council of Europe. It's not only because of the ocean, because of so many things. Russians, I think, are the Eastern version of that. Russia went, there's no ocean between Russia and the rest of Europe, but Russians, by moving across Siberia all the way to the Pacific, going north all the way to the Arctic and the North Pole and what have you, and south almost to the gates of Afghanistan, they got the experience that was lacking in many parts of Europe. And they have made themselves different from most Europeans. And I think that this even brings a distinction between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian tradition is different. Ukraine never experienced what we call the Mongol yoke, the way we experienced it in Russia. Similarly for Belarus, they lived under the Polish-Lithuanian kingdom for a long time, so they accepted being drawn into the European system in which they were not a sovereign state. That's a very different, but they got the Magdeburg sitter rights and so many other things. Very different traditions. So we have to take all that into account when we discuss these issues.
Okay, you mentioned the Arctic, and as you answered that question, this question pertains to that. Given Russia's upcoming chairmanship of the Arctic Council, what do you anticipate will be the government's main priorities during that 2-year chairmanship?
I think there'll be two. One is already evident today. A couple of days ago, the Russian Foreign Ministry has suggested that contacts between military officials at expert level, military officials from Russia, the US, Canada, Denmark, Norway, and I think also the countries that are members of the, not literal states, but members of the Arctic Council, such as Finland, Sweden, and Iceland, that although Iceland, as I understand, doesn't have an army, that they resumed the contacts that were broken off in 2014 after Ukraine. And I think this is very important because militarization of the Arctic has to be held in check. It cannot be reversed. For Russia, the Arctic is a very important strategic area because just north of Murmansk is the headquarters of the Russian Northern Fleet, which is the second nuclear strike weapon for Russia, the centerpiece of Russia's deterrence strategy. And of course, this is also close to the borders of Norway, and now exercises by both sides held in that area, naval exercises, air exercises, etc. So I think this is one thing. We need to hold that in check. We cannot imagine that militarization will stop, but it needs to be controlled. Second, I think, is climate change, and having discussions and I think agreements among the littoral states, first of all, on what to do with climate change, because essentially, much of Russian territory is covered by permafrost, and permafrost is now melting. It means that infrastructure is getting wobbly. That the cities built north of the Arctic Circle are becoming, they're getting unstable foundations, railroads, and just and all that. So and I would, for Russia itself, I think the economic value of the Northern Sea route that links Northern Europe to Eastern Asia is very important, and Russia wants to benefit from being the power with the longest the longest coast in the Arctic, and well, they want to have a little bit more sovereignty over that route. Other countries talk more about freedom of navigation, but there's certainly room for discussion and hopefully for eventual agreements.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned China when you made your remarks, but this question is sort of following up more specifically. The questioner is asking you, you think perhaps that the rivalry with China is the best opportunity for collaboration, not only with the United States, but also with Europe?
The problem is that the United States sees China as its principal challenger, as I would say loosely, the biggest threat, geopolitical threat to U.S. dominance, technology, economy, other issues. But that does not lead to the United States lowering its guard or getting soft on Russia. And you see the United States continuing the policy of pretty harsh pressure on Russia. And Russia's relations with Europe, as I've just described, are getting worse. So you may say that there is, in principle, an opportunity for Russia to use the Sino-American dispute as some kind of a distraction for the United States, an opportunity to offer something to the US in exchange for the things that Russia wants. I believe that I think that this was something that some people in the United States at the beginning of the previous administration thought, and they were making some ideas in that direction. From the Russian perspective, there's virtually no hope that the relations with the United States can be materially improved as long as the present attitude, which toward Russia in the United States, which seems well entrenched, which is bipartisan, which is shared by virtually the entire political class in the United States, the entire media community, and all that. In a way, Russia has also become, well, it was a political football in the Trump era in the United States, but it's also a kind of an adversary that you would love to have, because you can kick it around and you're not losing anything, because the trade relationship is well nigh non-existent. Nuclear relationship is immune to these little things. So you can do that. You can use Russia as an adversary for a lot of very pragmatic domestic and foreign policy reasons. On the other hand, Russians who waged two Cold Wars in the second half of the 20th century, the other one was against China, appreciate full well the value of a normal relationship with their huge neighbor. Russia shares a very long border with China, around 4,500 kilometers. And Russians used to look down on China for most of the 20th century and for most of the 19th century. Now they have to look up to see China rising and rising and rising. And they're being very careful not to do stupid things with regard to the Chinese. And of course, there's virtually no trust between Washington and Moscow. As much trust in Washington, or let's say as much trust in Moscow toward Washington as there is in Washington toward Moscow, meaning zero, nil. So unfortunately, the one relationship that could have been better handled, I think, is the Europe relationship. But for a number of reasons, it was not well handled. I'm sorry, I spoke for far too long. I will keep my answers to, I'll keep them concise next time.
Now, here's one that maybe you can answer quickly. This is from our one of our participants today, who in fact was born in Russia. She's asking, how do you respond to those who consider Russia a third world nation?
Well, I think in all countries there's a third world element. You pick a country and I will show you the third world element. Yeah, you may. I mean, there were people who called Russia a filling station masquerading as a state. Well, if you want to look at Russia that way, you're entitled to that. I wouldn't be bothered to respond. I think Russia, there are two things about Russia. Russia is normally downsized in the vision of Westerners, but the threats coming from Russia are exaggerated. That's part of the Western culture, a Western attitude toward Russia. It's always been that way. I think it will remain that way. So no comment. I really don't care about that.
Okay. Here's another one where Russian involvement with Syria has a geopolitical value alongside a military one. What is the strategic importance of Russian involvement in Libya? In essence, what is Russia doing in the Middle Eastern playground, in your opinion?
I don't think there's an overall strategy for the MENA region. I think in Syria, the immediate objective was to kill as many former Soviet jihadis as possible so that they never come back, support the regime that was under threat from Arab revolutionaries, Arab Spring revolutionaries inside, from the United States from the outside, and make a point, reverse the trend toward destabilization of the region, and make a point that the United States will not be changing regimes at will, where Russia is also having a role. These objectives having been met, I think the strategic value of Syria is that of a foothold in the region, from which Russia would be able to operate also in places like Libya. Russia has just signed an agreement with Sudan about a naval facility in the Red Sea. But essentially, it's not strategic, it's more opportunistic. So you can, by doing what Russia has been doing, Moscow has been able to win some lucrative deals with some rich Arab countries that have gained respect from Moscow at the time when support from Washington was on the waning side. So I think there's been overall a payoff, but strategically, I don't think there's a long-term view for the region as a whole.
Okay, thank you. We're getting close to the end of the hour. This may be our last question, and there's a lot of good questions we just simply can't get to, so I apologize to some of the askers, but this is a good one to close with. What does Russia without Vladimir Putin look like in the future, in your opinion?
Well, it's a bit hard to imagine, but I think it is more likely to be what it is today. So basically, I said at the beginning of this session that it's not Putin's Russia, but it's Russia's Putin. And I think that the future regime hopefully will be more focused on economic and technological development. I hope that it will be harsher on corruption and and decency in the government, cleansing the government, promoting meritocracy and stuff like that, more engagement with ordinary people. But if you're looking for Western-style democracy, look elsewhere. Maybe there'll be time for another question.
There is, if
I
you're
cut
willing
this
to
short.
do it.
Cut this short.
One of the commenters said, there's nothing wrong with long answers. These are not easy questions, so don't feel like you have to shorten your answer for that reason. Here's another one. How, in your opinion, has Russia dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic, and where do you see that affecting the society?
Well, I think Russia is not a champion in dealing with COVID. I don't think it excelled itself on the global plane as one of the best. Clearly not. The surprise to many, also inside Russia, was that Russia did not experience a catastrophe as a result of COVID, and that is a revelation. This is a reality check. So the Russian government, for all its failures, for all its flaws, and we can talk for hours about how bad the Russian bureaucracy is, how totally irresponsible the Russian elites are. We can talk, a lot about that. But interestingly enough, they managed better than certainly I expected in terms of lockdowns, in terms of unlocking the lockdowns, in terms of making sure that supplies reach people everywhere, wherever they live. I spent most of the pandemic on my dacha outside Moscow, and I worried for a period of time initially that my small supermarket close to where I was would not be well supplied during the pandemic. No, it was supplied as in the normal, usual fashion. So the basic services, including the medical services, clearly public health, operated reasonably well. And of course, the Russians came up with a vaccine, which is very important domestically, much more important domestically than internationally. A country that sees itself as a great power, as an independent sovereign, what have you. And if people are dying in huge numbers and you don't have a vaccine, you have to beg in Washington, you have to beg in Brussels, then you can lose power. Now, this did not happen. But of course, a lot of people are angry, a lot of people are tired, a lot of people are simply, too tired of having had to live through pandemic. But today, I'm sitting in Moscow today. It doesn't look like a city in the midst of a pandemic. A lot of people are wearing masks, but the restrictions are coming off one by one.
Okay. You got time for one more?
Yes.
Okay. This listener, this attendee is asking you to comment on Russia's relationship with Israel.
It's a very interesting relationship. I think it's the one country in the MENA region with which most Russians would culturally identify themselves, much more than with any other country, including Syria, including Turkey, wherever. 20% of Israelis are ex-Soviet, ex-Russian citizens. So you go there, and there are people who speak your language. There are people who have the, in a way, that's the place where the Soviet Union continues to live on in many ways. The communities which are, I wouldn't call them Russian, but they are Soviet in the sense of being imperial Russian. In a non-derogatory way. So you have people from Uzbekistan, Ukraine, Russia itself, Belarus, they all speak Russian, and they are a community. Israel is interesting because it's with it, Russia managed to construct a relationship that is not formally even a partnership, but it is a relationship of pretty good understanding of each other. A lot of similarity in the approach to the region. Russians and Israelis are realists above all. They never believed in the Arab Spring, for example. They never believed in liberalism taking root in the neighboring countries. They understand about power. They understand about having to fight, having to lose people, having to having to do things that are frowned upon by the custodians of international law if more important national interests are at stake. And for example, today, Israel regularly bombs Iranian targets in Syria, which is formally you may say, a Russian ally, or at least under Russian protection. Russia does not complain every time. It understands Israeli national security interests, but Russia and Israel disagree about things. They can have interesting and very informative conversations about Iran, for example, but Russia takes a view which is clearly different from the Israeli view. The Israeli view is more animated, more on the alert side, more, and the Russian view is I think, more relaxed about Iranian ambitions, about the Iranian anti-Israeli animus, but they have that dialogue. It's a very interesting relationship, very rich, but also something that it's like an iceberg. Much of that is beneath the surface. And Israel can be a close American ally and an informal partner of Russia at the same time. It was 2 years ago that Jerusalem saw a unique meeting of 3 national security advisors, one from Israel, one from the United States, and the third one from Russia. Can you imagine that anywhere else in the world? Probably not.
Well, let's leave it there. We have more time, but I think in respect for the hour that we allocated, I'm going to thank you. And you've had a number of comments come in the chat thanking you from individuals for an excellent presentation. So let me add that to mine. And I'd like to turn it back over now to Dr. Kennedy to close out our meeting.
You've exceeded all expectations. We're delighted that you had taken time to be with us. Your comments were very wide-ranging, very thoughtful, very informative, very candid in your responses to our questions. I think the thing that interested me almost more than anything was your commentary about the Asian political culture versus the sort of overall European culture, call it identity, that you see within the Russian people. I remember in my trips out to Siberia and coming back to Moscow, how people thought, well, Siberia must be, full of a lot of Asian people. But in fact, Khabarovsk, and you don't see anything but, or Vladivostok, you don't see anything but a sort of a European culture expressed in those areas. Right. So it seems to me that in that regard, probably the hardest thing for any integration ultimately with the West would be overcoming this sort of Asian political culture that you mentioned comes from sort of the consistent invasions, not just from Mongols, but also invasions from Cumans and the Teutonic Knights, all of those people that have invaded over the centuries, overcoming that need for the security, the basic security that you suggested, which leads to a strong central government. And the Westerners can never get through that barrier. And yet there's this seeming identity with each other, this European identity that exists between the United States, Europe, and indeed Russia. I hope in the future, as we look to developing closer relations, that somehow we can bridge that gap. So again, thank you so much. And thank everybody for joining us today. Stay safe, get your inoculations, and from ACR in Atlanta, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.